Last year, regulators approved the fewest number of drugs in 4 years. Only 21 medicines were okayed, and major drug makers like Merck and Pfizer were virtually shut out. That's not only impacting pharma companies, but also consumers. Joining us now is Dr. Steve Nissen. He's chairman of the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. He's also an advisor to several FDA committees. Doctor, thanks for coming on today. You know, Wall Street analysts look at this and see real costs in terms of potential earnings to these pharma companies. As a physician, as someone who watches the industry, how worried are you about this slowdown?
I'm actually not worried. This is really not reflecting a change in regulatory policy. It's reflecting a reality that a lot of the easier drugs to develop, certainly in my field in cardiology, have been developed. You know, the statin drugs are very effective at lowering cholesterol, and we have, ACE inhibitors for blood pressure and heart failure. And it's much more difficult to provide incremental benefit when you've already got very, very good drugs. I personally think that the metric of counting the number of new drug approvals is absolutely the wrong metric. We don't need more drugs, we need better drugs.
Well, from so many of the analysts watching pharma companies, they've already been worried about the pipeline, the drug development pipeline drying out, and then not getting more drugs to market is a worry in terms of the financial profitability of these companies. So there's going to be the demand, the push for more volume, it would seem, simply to get the companies to have earnings growth.
Well, I think the reality is that the companies probably need to get smaller. They have, massive sales forces of representatives appearing in doctors' offices, pushing these newer drugs. And, the reality is without a lot of new drugs, the downsizing is an appropriate approach for big pharma. Now, maybe new paradigms are coming, new ways to develop drugs, based upon genetic markers and other things. But I really think the reality is that this blockbuster era that we've had over several decades is fading, and we have a new reality that's set in.
You seem to be a little bit more optimistic in saying a lot of the good drugs are out there, so it's almost like innovation stalling a little bit. But when you talk to people who watch the industry, they say the FDA is kind of gun shy. I mean, you were very prominent, very vocal, the first physician to link Vioxx to some cardiovascular and stroke risk. Some say those experiences of getting it wrong are making the FDA almost inhibited about making decisions now. Do you think that what you did impact this?
I don't think so. I actually think that the problem is that when the industry has already picked the low-hanging fruit, the easy drugs to develop, they're reaching toward drugs that have a less favorable benefit to risk. And the FDA is appropriate and prudent in looking much more closely at these drugs. The other thing you have to realize is that industry has invested a lot of money in knockoff drugs, in drugs that are not new molecular entities, but are drugs that are based upon existing drugs, because it's cheaper and faster to bring those to market. If you don't invest in innovation, you don't get innovation.
Let me ask you about what's happening in Washington next week. We're going to see this vote, part of the GOP promise on the campaign trail to try to repeal health care reform. Many write that off as largely symbolic. But what is definitely a threat, some would say, is the ability to control the purse strings and fund some of these new efforts. I know drug makers want to neutralize some of the panels that are looking at Medicare spending. How much of a risk to care, how much of an impact to care are you expecting?
I don't think there's going to be much change. I think we're going to hear a lot of noise, a lot of heat, but very little light. The reality is, if you ask people what they don't like about healthcare reform, it's very hard for them to get very specific. Does anybody want to go back to the era when insurance companies can deny care to people because of pre-existing conditions? So I would ask the people that want it.
But the Republicans have been fairly specific as to what they don't like about the law. Medicaid expansion, they're pushing back against. They're threatening not to provide money that would fund some of these, as I just said, that panel, Medicaid? And
so they want to let poor people die on the street? I mean, look, we have a country that we had 50 million people without health insurance. This health care reform was designed to provide coverage for those people. If you stop and take a deep breath and think about it, a lot of them were getting care anyway. They were coming in emergency departments, not getting preventive care. You know, if you really drill down on this, I think what you see is this has largely become a very political, very symbolic issue. The reality is we have to have health care reform. It's not going to go away.
So what will change for you as a health care provider before 2014?
You know, I don't think very much is going to change. Look, we provide care for people, some of whom have excellent insurance, some of whom have Medicare, some of whom have Medicaid, some of whom have no insurance at all. What's going to change primarily is we're going to see more people that have at least some coverage. That's a good thing because no physician ever wants to turn away a patient who needs health care. And so the intent of the bill, the health care reform, was to make certain that Americans had access to health care. Those principles are going to continue to move forward. You can't turn back the clock. After Medicare, there was a huge hue and cry. I mean, there were people who wanted to repeal Medicare. Nobody today looks back and says that was the wrong thing to do.
Well, there's certainly Republicans who do have problems with Medicare under this new law, but we're going to continue to track this. It's always interesting to hear from you, Doctor. Thanks for making time today.
My pleasure.